know, we're going to start talking about Lot and why the Bible calls Lot a righteous man, because it certainly doesn't seem like he is by the standards that I would apply. So, we're in Genesis chapter 18. Well, we're going to look at Genesis 18 for a minute here. We're actually in 2 Peter chapter 1 or chapter 2, but we're going to look at Genesis 18 for a minute here because we have this passage. We started looking at it yesterday where Peter is talking about judgment and the certainty of judgment, even though it's not immediate, that it is certain. It's kind of interesting because as an attorney, and actually in my criminal justice classes, one of the things you take a look at is what makes punishment effective as a deterrent. In other words, keeping people from doing bad things. Punishment there's two dominant theories of punishment. Well, there's three really. One is rehabilitative. We send people to prison to make them be better people and come back out. They learn their lesson. History and math tells us that's not happening, and that probably has never happened. The other two dominant theories are that prison and punishment is a deterrent, which means it keeps people from doing things. And the third one is that punishment has to do with debts to society, that when somebody commits a crime, they incur a debt to society that they have to pay off, and that's what's happening with prison or even with the death penalty. So of the three, the one that sounds the nicest and would make the most sense and benefit for our society would be deterrence, where if we punish criminals, then it would tend to lower the likelihood of them committing crimes, or other people committing crimes as well, because they would see the consequences and choose not to do it. The problem is that almost every study of deterrence says that for it to be effective, there's three things that have to happen. Punishment has to happen quickly, it has to happen consistently, and it has to be sufficiently proportionate to the crime to make people not want to do the crime. In other words, the consequence is higher than the benefit that you might receive from the crime. And even then, it completely fails to work in situations where people are committing crimes of passion, where they're doing things without necessarily thinking it through. And the problem is that when you look at our justice system, we don't really hit on any of those things very well. We're not very, if you commit a crime, the likelihood of you being convicted and sentenced anytime soon is usually pretty low. If you commit a crime, unless you do something that's got a lot of witnesses or something, the chances of you getting convicted are generally below 50%. And if you're punished, in some cases our punishment is all out of proportion, which some of our drug offenses, for example. But in many cases, the punishment simply isn't that serious relative to what people have done. And what I think is interesting here in this context is that when we talk about God, there's certainly, in the punishment for sin, there's certainly a severity to it. And there is a certainty of it if you believe. But the one thing that definitely isn't, generally speaking, is a swiftness to it. Because in many cases, the Bible tells us it waits a long time. And humans, one of the things that we're not very good at is thinking long term. We have to teach ourselves and work really hard to think long term, even when it comes to things like our finances and our health and some of these kinds of things that we can see direct benefits from. When you take the direct benefit out of it, it gets really hard for us to think long term. And that's why I think so many people struggle with this idea of consequence when it comes to spiritual stuff. And it also is why so many people don't particularly seem to be very concerned about our criminal laws, because there's not that connection that we have between deterrence and what we're trying to do. So anyway, what Peter is trying to do is to make clear that the threat of punishment is real, and that the consequence is real, even though the time frame may not be within what we're used to, and it may not be an immediate kind of a thing. In Peter's time, most of the people who did something that was criminal were used to the idea of justice happening very, very quickly. For one thing, in the Roman Empire, unless you were a citizen, you didn't even have a right to a trial. If they decided you were guilty, they just got decreed guilty, and then they did whatever it was that they wanted to do. And the punishments were, generally speaking, very, very harsh. And so people in the Roman Empire learned to take the law seriously because of the fact that it happened, justice happened quickly, it happened pretty definitively, and it was not at all nice whatever they were going to do to you. And so Peter needs to explain to people that this is still going to really be a problem, even though they're not seeing it necessarily. And even though they're seeing people around them who are not necessarily acting like they have anything to be afraid of when it comes to God. And so he uses Sodom and Gomorrah as the chief example of that, in terms of people who were living and presumably had lived for a long time in a very unrighteous way, but eventually judgment came. And so in this case, he talks about, he mentions using Sodom and Gomorrah as an example for people who came later, and even explaining to Abraham why these things were happening, to make sure that Abraham passed it on to his children, because his children were going to carry that message. Even if they weren't very good at necessarily always doing what God wanted, even if they did not necessarily operate as a proselytizing religion, going out and telling people, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was going to be passed down through Abraham and Moses and those descendants until it would get to us today. So everybody today that's familiar with the Bible, well, most everybody anyway, is at least vaguely familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's a reason why we have the word sodomy in our own language, actually, because it derives from that concept. So I think probably missing the point of some of the other bad things they were doing, but still. So we see this being passed down. So this all seems pretty straightforward. That God wants us to understand that there is really a consequence for what we do, and he uses examples like Sodom and Gomorrah and others in the Bible in particular to show us that there is consequence. And we know that there's a consequence for the things that we do if we ignore natural rules. You know, you ignore gravity, walk off a building, you're probably going to fall to your death. You ignore, physics, and you walk in front of a truck, and you're probably going to end up dead that way too. You engage in, some kind of when you engage in risky behavior, whatever kind of risky behavior it is, there's a high probability that something bad is going to happen to you as a result of that. So spiritually risky behavior is no different. There's a high probability something bad is going to happen to you. This is where we get to Lot, and this is where things get kind of weird for me, because what Peter goes on to say is that he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men. And this is where things get a little trickier, because I don't really see in the Bible, the Old Testament story, where Lot seemed to be particularly oppressed until the very end of the story. He seems to have made a very conscious choice to go where he did, to move further and further into the city, and to kind of surround himself with very bad people, who he knew were very bad. It wasn't like he was surprised about this. And yet, Peter, who is inspired, says he was a righteous man and he was oppressed by unprincipled men. Now, we know he was a righteous man. How do we know he was a righteous man even before Peter told us? These are the kind of thought questions I ask my students, and you have the exact same look that most of them do. What was, no, but that's right. What was it?
He was saved.
He was saved. So remember that the deal that God made with Abraham was if he could find 10 righteous men, that he would spare the city. Well, God did him one better and basically rescued Lot, because Lot was the only righteous man in the city. So he wasn't going to bring the judgment down on him, particularly not after having had that conversation with Abraham. Because I think, number one, Lot's related to Abraham and God has a special relationship with him. But secondly, because he wants to make it clear that there was literally nobody else righteous in that city besides Lot. And so Lot and his daughters are the only ones, and his wife, well, mostly, were rescued. She was rescued partly, but then she ignored the rule and turned and looked back, and that was, that was for her. So anyway, not so good. But the point is that Lot was apparently righteous because he did do the right things when the angels came into the city, in terms of trying to protect them, in terms of, and obviously he was not happy with the way things were. But at the same time, Lot has made a series of bad decisions that have put him in that situation. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. And it also, I guess, is important for us to recognize that this apparently creates a principle that you can make some bad decisions and still be a righteous person, which is actually a really good bit of news for the rest of us, because all of us have made some bad decisions, and sometimes really bad decisions in some cases, and we are still viewed as righteous because of God's salvation. So when we look at Lot and the choices that he made, we see in Genesis chapter 13 the first bad choice. Because Abraham and Lot, they've got these big flocks and herds, they're both prospering, and the problem is that they're together, and because they're too close together, they're herdsmen, and are they flocksmen if you're over a flock? I don't, shepherds, I guess, probably. Anyway, they're starting to get into fights because there's not enough places to graze all the sheep, and there's not enough water, presumably. So Abraham says, please let there be no strife between you and me. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, I will go to the right. If to the right, then I will go to the left. So Abraham, who was the senior of the two, had the ability to say, you go here, and I'll go here. And instead he gives Lot the choice. And Lot, it says, he lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, which, by the way, a little side note here, it suggests that when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it altered the ecology of that whole area in some way. But he says it's like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar, which if you're going into Egypt there, the Nile waters that area and makes it extremely fertile. And so Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. So Lot goes eastward, he goes inland towards the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and those areas in there. And Abraham goes east, or goes westward and southward into, or closer into what's referred to as the Negev of Judah, which is a much drier and more arid area, a much more difficult place to keep sheep and herds and stuff like that. So Lot's first choice is based on what? Okay, it looks good. This is nice land. So he's choosing what is going to be easier and what is going to be nicer. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but again, we're going to see, or I don't know if we're going to see this or not. No. So what we see in the story, though, of Abraham and Lot is that it's only a little bit later that Lot, who at this time is not living in the city but is living near Sodom and Gomorrah, is taken away with by a group of 5 kings that were probably proto-Amalek. So they were Amalekites before they were actually Amalekites, the ancestors, that's where I look for. Ancestors of the Amalekites came and conquered Sodom and Gomorrah and took the city and its king and its people, including Lot and all of their goods, and took off with them. And Abraham gathers together his private security force and runs after them and defeats them in battle and rescues everybody. And when the king of Sodom promises to give Abraham 1/10 of everything that he's got, which is basically sort of like it's almost like offering a sacrifice, a tithe, basically, Abraham refuses. And he says, the men who came with me, they can take it if they want to, but I'm not going to take anything from you, because I've sworn to God I won't take anything from you. Now, there's 2 reasons under which a man who's principled like Abraham might say that. One would be if the person that he was dealing with was someone in poverty, and so he's saying, I'm not going to take something from you because that wouldn't be right. But that seems unlikely since it's the king of the city-state, so what's the reason why Abraham won't take anything from him?
You think it was tainted?
He thinks it's tainted. He knows what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. He knows what kind of people they are, and everybody does probably. And which means Lot does too. Lot knows where he's living and the kind of people he's living around. And so he decides, nevertheless, to stay there. So instead of, after that event, saying, you know what, maybe this isn't the best place for me. You know, maybe I need to move on. Because remember, Lot doesn't belong there, just like Abraham didn't. And in many cases, they had to be kind of cared for where they went so they didn't anger people and upset them, especially as they're getting more and more prosperous. The people of the land are getting more and more concerned about this, I'm sure. So they have to keep on the move, except Lot has kind of associated himself with the men of Sodom, and they seem to be okay with him now. So he could easily move on, because Abraham is going to move on, and he's going to wander all over in Canaan. Lot could do the same thing, but Lot decides instead to tie himself even more closely to Sodom and Gomorrah by moving into the city of Sodom. Now, whether that was because he was getting older, I mean, by this time he's got, even though he's Abraham's nephew, Abraham's getting up into his mid-90s, so Lot is probably in his 70s or so. He may be looking to kind of settle down, you know. He's kind of turned over the operation of the herds to maybe his sons or his, to his employees, and he's moving into Sodom and Gomorrah where he can live, or into Sodom where he can live more comfortably and not have to be out in the desert living in a tent. We don't know for sure, but whatever the reason was, he moves in there with his 2 daughters. So he gets closer to the people who are bad instead of getting further away from them. And yet, the scriptures say that he's righteous and he's oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men. So he's made a choice to be somewhere that he probably shouldn't be, and yet he is still the righteous guy feeling bad about the situation that he's in. So I think that the lesson we need to bring out of this is that it is possible for someone who is a Christian to make bad choices and still maintain their Christianity, but it's not ideal for them to do that. And I think this is where we need to be able to make the distinction. So just because Lot was considered to be righteous, just because he was not happy about the situation that he was in and oppressed and so on and so forth, doesn't mean that that was the best choice for him to be there, that he didn't have any other alternatives. So on the one side of this, we need to be mindful of the fact that being Christian and being saved doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to make bad choices, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't try to do better than the situation that we're in, and make choices that will better who we're surrounded by, what we're engaged in or what they're engaged in, and not have to deal with that. On the other side of it, we should also recognize that Christians can persevere even in situations that aren't very good. whether it's been enforced on us from the outside or whether we've made bad choices and we're dealing with the consequences of them, we can live in a society that's not a particularly good society and still be Christians, still be righteous, still be doing what God wants, and trying to do the right thing. And that's probably a good thing, because we live in a society that's very, very unrighteous these days. You know, and so being able to live here and to be a part of that while still maintaining our Christianity is a constant challenge, but it is something that is possible. And the story of Lot would suggest that that's the case. And the other thing we've got to bear in mind is, as Christians, part of our job is to go into the world and to preach the gospel, and sometimes that means going places that aren't very nice to preach the gospel. And so having that awareness that we can still be righteous and still make good choices, even when we have to go into ugly places and do be around ugly people, I mean sinfully speaking, is a good thing to know. Even if it's not entirely clear always why why Lot may have made the choices he did, we can look at him and say, okay, here's an example of someone who's in a very bad place and is still maintaining his righteousness. So that's the good news for us, even if, like I said, sometimes I'm confused about the characterization of it, because that's what the Bible says, and I'm okay with that. So, okay, thoughts on this topic before I move on? Jerry?
I was just thinking, Peter's comments makes the same thing. He said, you know, that it tells them, I'm not telling you to not associate with evil people in the world.
Right.
Because to that, if you did that, you'd have to be out of the world.
That's Paul, I think, actually.
Paul, okay, yeah. wrong
well,
letter.
The P's always throw you off, so,
yeah.
And then John gets in there and it gets really confusing, so, yeah.
But that just
yeah, no,
same idea.
That's exactly right. You know, if you're going to be in the world, but not of the world, you do actually have to be around those things. And there's not really, I mean, I guess, you know, if you could take the monk or nun approach and, you know, go off in a monastery or a cloister somewhere and disassociate yourself from the world. And I think that there are probably some people for whom, some scholar types, that maybe that would make a certain amount of sense, but for the vast majority of Christians, going off and separating ourselves from the world is a counterproductive thing, because our primary objective in the world is to love one another, but also then to spread the gospel. And you can't do that if you're hiding from the bad people who need the gospel, you know? So there is a necessity that we be in the world. How closely we have to tie ourselves to the world, I think that's where we sometimes want to use that as the excuse. You know, well, I'm in the world, not of the world, that's why, you know, I'm living in the middle of, you know, this very, very bad place, surrounded by all these bad people, and I don't really try to do anything to convert any of them, but because I'm supposed to be in the world, so here I am, you know. We need to be thinking about that. But nevertheless, there's a need for us to be, not to go off and, you know, buy, you know, 100 acres of ranch and build a farmhouse in the middle of it with, you know, gates and no trespassing signs and trying to get away from all of it, you know. That's just not a practical way of living our lives. So, or not at least what God wants. Sometimes for some people it might be practical.
The other thing Paul said in Corinthians was, that evil companions corrupt.
Right.
I mean, so there's a dichotomy. There's this. He's saying you're in the world, but you got to be careful.
And he talks about friendship with the world is enmity towards God. So our relationship with the world, if we forget that our relationship with the world is an adversarial one in nature, we can very easily get way too comfortable with the world and the people in the world and the things that the world is doing. And that doesn't mean we have to constantly be hostile to the world, because that's not a good way to convert anybody. Being friendly, being kind, spending time with people. Jesus spent a lot of time with, you know, tax collectors and prostitutes and people who were considered to be sinful by the Jews, and yet did not lose track of the idea that he was there to do a specific task or a group of tasks. And when we look at Jesus, there is a clear distinction, because the 12 people he chooses to associate with himself really closely, his close friends, his apostles, with the exception of Judas, are people who are people of good character. People who, maybe they're kind of rough around the edges, they don't have the sort of pedigree that would put you in the Sanhedrin or something like that. They are definitely the kind of people who are looking for good things and who are trying to get better and to learn and to be taught. And he's giving them special insight, and he's having a special relationship with them. So when we think in those terms, then that kind of hopefully gives us a little bit of a sense of how our relationship with the world versus the people we're really close to should be. And so being inviting and being thoughtful and being friendly and developing positive relationships with people in the world, every bit of that is something we see Jesus doing. When it comes to the people that we're really close to, the people that we're really spending a lot of our time with and that we're giving a lot of our attention to, those people should be the kind of people who are not tending to corrupt good laws, who are people of character and quality. So, okay, so let's move on. So Peter goes on. This is that. If you remember, this was a page-long sentence. So, so he says, this is how Lot was oppressed. For by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. Now, again, there's a part of me, the cynical part of me, that says it sure didn't seem like he was. He moved further into the city, he was hanging out with those guys, and those are the people who were around him. On the other hand, it is possible that, but certainly it's said here, that he is deeply troubled by what's going on in that city, what he's seeing those people do. That is something that is tormenting him as he watches it. Now, the obvious question that the cynic, me, would ask is, well, then why don't you move? You know, it's kind of, and now, to use an example that's not a particularly one-to-one example, but it's one of those ones that I always, before I got involved with criminal justice, at least never understood what women, or for that matter men, who were in an abusive relationship, stayed in that relationship. And you learn, as you study that more, or as you experience dealing with that problem more as a prosecutor and others, that it's not simply a matter of, you know, it's not so easy as saying, just why don't you just leave? There's economic reasons why that's difficult. There's children that are involved in many cases. There is a cycle, a mental cycle that goes on when it comes to abuse and recovery and stuff like that, that makes people think that this is something that's going to get better. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. And to a certain extent, I think that the parallels to Lot are not completely non-existent. You know, he's built his life there. And he is, you know, maybe thinking he can change people, maybe thinking, you know, that he's a good example. He can give himself some different excuses, and he can still be recognizing that the situation is really bad and be upset by what he's seeing around him. And as American Christians, we probably see that too. You know, we see what's going on around us, and we're upset by it, and we're deeply concerned about it, and yet this is where we live. You know, these are the neighborhoods and the cities in which we live, and it's not so easy to just say, well, why don't you just go leave, you know? Sure.
There's one more point that is totally, absolutely opinion, but that we see by Lot's wife that she turns around and disobeys what she'd been commanded to do. There's a possibility in my mind that she was the influence on Lot to move into town.
Could be.
You know, that the effect or the value of constant nagging may have ended up with him moving.
Could be, yeah. Well, and it's not clear. I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look in detail, and I don't want to do that right now, but I don't remember whether Lot was married before or after he got there. So it's also possibly he married someone who was a Canaanite. But you're right, that is a possibility. Certainly, when we see the end of Lot, and we're not going to go through the whole sorry story, but when you see the end of Lot's story, it seems that his daughters are not particularly morally upright either. You know, they're just, the level of dysfunction in that whole family is pretty extreme. And so exactly what was causing it, we don't know, but what we, like I said, what Peter says is he is constantly upset with what he's saying. And again, I think that there's a lot of parallels to us as Christians in the United States, where we see a lot of sin and a lot of immorality and a lot of acceptance of a lot of different things that we disagree with religiously and culturally and morally and all of that. And yet we still live here because this is our home. And even though we might have the ability, some of us at least in terms of our wealth or whatever, to get away from culture as much as possible, either getting ourselves out away from everything or moving to another country or something like that, we're here and this is our home, and so we try to change it, and we try not to be sucked into it, but it is a reality that we have to face. Now, again, what I see that's interesting in Lot's story, so the morning dawns, and the angel said to Lot, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. So this is probably the first that Lot has heard about punishment of the city, but it says he hesitated. So he doesn't want to leave because this is where his home is, this is where his stuff is. It's like, you know, when there's a fire about to get to your house and you're trying to figure out what to take with you, and you're getting kind of stuck in that process because you want to keep those things that are part of your life, part of your history. But the man, it says, seized his hand and the hand of his wife and the hands of his 2 daughters and just dragged them because the compassion of the Lord was upon him. So God is doing everything he can, and everything he can as Lot, to make sure that Lot and his family get out, because he is the righteous man. And they brought him out and put him outside the city. So they save him from the city. Well, they get him to that point, and then they say, go. You've got to get as far away from here as you can. Go to the mountains. If you don't get to the mountains, you're not going to survive. So take your wife, take your daughters, get to the mountains. Now, this is a really interesting part of the story to me, because Lot says, I can't make it that far. I'm never going to make it that far in the amount of time you're giving me. Can I go and stay? And there's this little city, little town, a little ways outside of Sodom and Gomorrah. I think it's Zoar. I'm not sure about that. But there's this little town, and he says, what about if I go there? And the angels, I don't know if they like check with God first, or they're just like, okay, you go there, and that'll be fine. So he goes to that city. And then, you know, fire and brimstone rain down on Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land around them, and there's this one little town in the middle of all of that doesn't get any of it. Can you imagine if you're in that little town and you're just watching everything around you for miles is just being destroyed, and you're like, wow, that was lucky. You know, it's just, I mean, what do you, because none of them knew what was going on. Imagine being in that situation. But also the side effect of this is, consider what the value of a righteous man is to Lot, or to God. 10 of them would have been enough to spare Sodom and Gomorrah, the most evil places. I mean, they're associated with the very concept of evil. One guy was enough to spare a town that should have been under the judgment of the Lord as well, because he went into that city. A righteous man or woman brings with them a lot of protection for some pretty bad people around them in some cases. And so it's kind of an amazing aspect of the story of Lot that this city is saved simply because Lot couldn't make it to the mountains. That's it. Now, after the destruction stops, he and his girls just keep on going, because they're like, okay, we don't know if there's a second wave coming or what the deal is, but they end up going to the mountains and living there. But this is a kind of a remarkable situation on so many different levels because of the compassion of the Lord and the compassion that he has, particularly for the righteous. And so Lot is protected. He is saved from that because he is a good man. And so Peter goes on to say, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation. So Lot stands as evidence that God can rescue the godly from, in his case, from destruction, but also from temptation. And so we know that that can happen even when bad things are going on around us. And in Corinthians, Paul says, now these things happened to them as an example. They were written for our instruction. He's talking about judgments that had happened, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. In other words, we've got all this stuff coming down to us, and now here we are at the end of the age, or the final days, depending on which passage you're looking at. And we are the ones who are carrying the righteousness of God and carrying the gospel of God. So Paul says, therefore, let he who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. So we know we're going to be tempted, and we know we're going to be tempted by the same kind of stuff that people have been tempted by forever. Even if it looks different, it's the same basic stuff. You know, lust may have gotten a lot more advanced thanks to the internet, but it's still lust. You know, and anger may be a lot more political than it used to be, but it's still anger. You know, so when we look at these things, they evolve in terms of how they look. What's underneath them is still always that same stuff and that same basic temptation. And Corinthians tells us that we can escape temptation with God's help every time, not just some of the time. Jesus stands as evidence of that, and you know, there's a lot of people that the Hebrew writer references that stand as evidence of that as well. So, but we've got to be careful, because if we get arrogant, if we get self-righteous, then that's when things go badly. But God can rescue the unrighteous from temptation as well as from destruction. Yes, ma'am.
On the part before, it first talks about an angel and then it talks about man. So when you get some help from God at some point, do you have a person basically that has the insight, or? Okay,
so you talk about where it says angels up here, and then down here it says the men seized his hand.
Yes.
So this is where, I'll answer your question in a second. First, let me address this. These are angels, they're messengers from God, but they have taken on the form of men. And so it's kind of like saying, when you're dealing with somebody who, let's say somebody who's 19 years old, and we're all in our, let's say, well, all of us, a couple of us are in our 50s or more. We're dealing with somebody who's 19 years old. We might call that man a boy. He's not literally a boy. If we were being more precise, we would say, that 19-year-old man. But when we're being imprecise, we might refer to them that way because relative to us, he's much younger. Or a girl, someone who's in their, 19, 20, 21, something like that. So in this case, it's not so much that there's a differentiation. They're still the same people they were, but these are angels who've taken on a human form. And so that's why he's using the term angel and men is used interchangeably in sort of the similar way that sometimes we see the term angel and angel of the Lord and the Lord used interchangeably, especially if you look at the story of Gideon. When he first encounters God or the angel of the Lord, it keeps switching back and forth between saying those two things because in that situation, the angel, first of all, apparently looked like a man because it freaked Gideon out when he saw him, and most of the time when some dude just walks up to me, I don't freak out. So he probably didn't look like a man very much, or at least not like a normal man. But in that particular case, that angel appears to have been serving almost like as an avatar for God, where God was working directly through him to interact with Gideon. So angels seem to be they're sort of versatile in the ability to sort of be vessels of God's will, whether they are messengers, just here's the message, go take it, or God is working directly through them. There seems to be a degree to which they can kind of be malleable into what God needs them to be. That's a much more complex answer. But to go to the question you asked, and when we talk about this, how God intervenes in our lives can look a lot of different ways, a lot of different times. It can be people that are put into our lives who have been given, a special insight. Or it can simply be people who are good people who just happen to say the right thing, or not just happen to. It seems like they just happen to say the right thing at the right time, or do the right thing at the right time, and it works. And we don't know. The one, I forget if it's Peter or Paul that says, some of you have entertained angels unknown. So because angels can look like people, it's possible that one of them has wandered through our life and pushed us in one direction or another. And there are a lot of other things. Amy Grant writes a song about angels watching over me, or angels is the name of the song. And she talks about, the thing that causes you to back out of your driveway 30 seconds later than you're going to is maybe the thing that kept you being, 2 seconds too late to run into that car that was speeding through the intersection. Things that we don't necessarily ever know happen because God, in his providence, moves things around the way he wills. So, in the scriptures, they give us examples of God doing things that are very, very dramatic. Parting the Red Sea and dropping fire down on Sodom and Gomorrah, or one of the lowest key miracles in the Bible, when Philip is simply transported from God puts him out on a road to meet an Ethiopian eunuch, and he's there at exactly the right time as this guy's driving by his church to explain to him the gospel and what it means. And he baptizes him, and then it says he was just gone because the Spirit of God took him, and he appeared somewhere else. And if I understand that correctly, that's pretty much the transporter in Star Trek, right? Just beamed out and beamed in somewhere else over here. Now, I have a couple of questions about this. Number one, did Philip get a warning about that? Like this guy, get ready, or just boom, and all of a sudden how disorienting would that be? And what if you were on the street and that happened right in front of you? But if you're a little kid and you go home and tell your parents you're going to get beat for making up lies about stuff, it's a fascinating kind of a story, and yet we don't really spend much time actually thinking about how crazy it is that happened. So God intervenes in ways that are manifest in some cases, but in many cases in ways that are not manifest to us simply by arranging things. One of the examples we see in the scriptures about this that is not, an explanation is given, that's the only reason we know this, is that the route that the Israelites took when they left Egypt was extraordinarily it was really, really inefficient to get to the chosen land. Because if you remember the story of Jacob and Joseph is taken to Egypt and he's sold into slavery. He eventually rises to position of power, and then the famine happens and he arranges to have his family brought to him. And if you think about the Mediterranean Sea, which is kind of, you have the Mediterranean, this is Israel, or will be Israel up here, Egypt is down here. All he did was he sent, he didn't, I don't know if he went or not, but he sent soldiers and the Egyptian army, and they went and got him, and they brought him down just straight down through Canaan into Egypt. And they stayed there in kind of the upper, what would be the, I'm looking at this backwards, so the north east area in Egypt, which is very fertile. So when the Israelites went back, why didn't they just go right back the same way? Anybody know? It's in the Bible, so I'm not actually just asking you to speculate.
The power of God.
That is true, but why did God take them a totally different way? Because when they leave Egypt, so again, Mediterranean Egypt, they go down way far south. Well, they cross over the Red Sea, which was completely unnecessary if they'd gone the other way. We wouldn't even have to deal with the Red Sea. And they go down, they cross over the Red Sea, and they end up down in the desert here before coming up and around. And that's before they were made to wander in the desert. Because remember, initially, he took them to Sinai, gives them law, and then he takes them on up around, and they loop around, and they enter across the Jordan into Canaan from that direction, or they were going to. And they get to the Jordan, they send the spies are freaked out, the people freak out, and God says you can't go for 4 years until you're all dead, and your descendants, your sons and daughters are going to take over the promise. So, why do all of that?
I think it was because he wanted to kill the army of Pharaoh.
Okay, well, maybe so. But even then, he could have done that and then taken the quick route after that. It's actually in the Bible. Anybody know why he did that? The scriptures actually say there's a very specific reason why God did this. And the answer, to save you all from having to try and look up something with no actual keywords to work off of, is because God said if they go this way, they're going to encounter the strongest of all of the Canaanites. The Philistines, some of the most warlike of all the Canaanites, and they're going to be invading their land at a point that they're not ready to do it. They haven't seen war. They've been slaves for 400 years. There is no way that they can walk into that and be expected to face that. Not that I can't, not that God couldn't do it, but he said they're going to lose heart if I try to do it that way. So we're going to take them south. And what happens when they go south at Sinai?
Well, God appears to them.
Okay. So God appears to them, he forms covenants with them. By the time they've done that, they've been following, well, first of all, they've seen the destruction of Pharaoh's army. They're following the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. They're seeing miraculous things being done. They're being taken care of by God in an absolutely untenable situation. Wandering through a desert without water, without food. God is taking care of all that. So God is trying to teach them to do what?
Rely on him.
Rely on him, to trust him. Even still, when that first generation gets to the edge of the Jordan, they're not ready. Because when they hear that it's bad, they won't go in. So he tried to prepare them, and they weren't ready. It took another 40 years of wandering in the desert and getting rid of that slave generation and bringing up the kids who had either been born just young when they were in Egypt or who were born after Egypt to grow up and not be a nation of slaves. And what he does is he deliberately avoids, on several different occasions, it says this in the Bible, he deliberately avoids taking them certain places because the people that they would be facing is too warlike. What he basically does is what happens if you play a game like Street Fighter, where you play increasingly difficult opponents and you have to beat one after another until you get to the big boss. That's what he's doing, is he's taking them up against the less warlike nations, the less capable ones, giving them confidence in him, so that when they finally do go into Canaan, they're ready to do it, and they're not afraid of being able to do it. So God does this. Now, if he didn't tell us that, it would just look like God is really lacking a GPS system, right? But instead, we know there's a reason why he does that. And there's a reason why things that happen in our lives happen in sometimes very confusing ways that don't necessarily seem as direct as we'd like them to be. And sometimes, at least, it's because God is moving things around to protect us, to provide us with opportunities, to use his providence to make us more effective and put us where we need to be. So this is an important principle to understand, and I realize I got way off track from what we were looking at, but I think it's worth taking a look at, and Sue's question kind of led me into that discussion. So we're going to stop, though, because we are actually out of time now. Any last comments before we break up here? Okay, thank you guys for being here.